all black everything, all black, you know, all black in the name of all my black heroes, all black everything, all black polos, all black medallions, yeah, all black, yo.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we are here today in the Blue Parlor. We want to thank the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies here at Duke University for allowing us to use the space, as we welcome Professor Rinaldo Walcott here. Rinaldo Walcott is the Carl V. Granger Chair in Africana and American Studies at the University of Buffalo. He's the author of several books, including the classic Black Like Who, Writing Black Canada, published by Insomniac Press, 1997, second edition in 2003. Edited Ruled, Contemporary Black Canadian Cultural Criticism, 2000. In 2016, Queer Returns, Essays on Multiculturalism, Diaspora, and Black Studies. In 2019, Black Life, Post-BLM and the Struggle for Freedom. In 2021, we got two books on property, which was published by Biblio Oasis, and The Long Emancipation, Moving Toward Black Freedom, published by Duke University Press in 2021. How are you doing, Rinaldo?
I'm doing pretty good, yeah.
It's, you know, we've been doing this for 13 years, right? And part of what is fun now is tracking down the folks we've never had on the show. So it's so great to have you on campus, to have you in the studio, you know, our makeshift studio for the day. Talk a little bit about why you're visiting Duke.
So I'm visiting Duke because Dr. Lamont, has invited me to give a master class on stuff that I've recently worked on, like the Long Emancipation and property, but also what I'm thinking about now. So I'm thinking a lot about questions of freedom, continuing from Long Emancipation, thinking about reparations and the problem of the economization of Black life. And, you know, I'm returning to my past where I'm returning to some of the questions of psychoanalysis and Black life. Yeah.
Talk about this most recent book, The Long Emancipation, and you make some compelling claims about making a distinction between emancipation and freedom. Unfreedom, if you will, as Deborah McDowell describes it, you know, as she talked about the book. What is a long emancipation?
Yeah. So, you know, I came to the idea of the long emancipation in terms of thinking about the end of slavery in the British colonies, in the US, in Brazil, in Cuba, anywhere that there was Black enslavement, and the kind of formal legislative end of slavery is named as emancipation. And I really wanted to think about what happened in the wake of emancipation. And of course, on thinking this question of what happens in the wake of emancipation, I'm joining scholars like Saidiya Hartman who've also raised these questions. But what I try to do in the Long Emancipation is say that we are still in the time of emancipation, and that freedom is not something that is legislated or can be legislated, but emancipation can be. And I think it's really important that we're able to make that distinction, because then it begins to allow us to see how continually legislation is used to keep Black people in certain kinds of bondage.
Yeah.
And that legislation can be as simple as an ordinance against sagging pants. But it can be even more profound, as we see in contemporary Uganda, as new legislation passed against LGBTQ people, right? And so for me, the question of emancipation is not one that is only tied to slavery, it's also tied to the post-colonial Caribbean and African states, where the forms of independence that they were ushered into also continue within the time of bondage.
Yep.
Yeah.
You describe emancipation as a compromise, right? A compromise that allows a control over Black bodies, whether that's in the language of emancipation like we talk about in the US, or independence, as we talk about in these colonial states. What do you think that means for the Black public at large in the midst of Black Lives Matter in the midst of what we saw go down in 2020, it's almost as if we're spinning our wheels, right, and talking about, freedom at this moment.
Most definitely. I think what it means is that so many of our efforts become caught up in reforming or trying to perfect systems that were not built for our own perfection. Yeah. So we find ourselves believing that, if we could only have the police do their job the right way, then they wouldn't be killing us. We find ourselves thinking that if we could only teach doctors the right kind of pedagogy, then they wouldn't give us these terrible diagnoses and lack of treatment. We find ourselves thinking if we could really reform these schools that you and I teach in, that they would become better entities and support Black life. And so, to be in the time of emancipation is to be trapped in the very system
right.
That is killing you. And part of that is because the system understands that any kind of revolt against it is meant to overturn it. And so the time of emancipation in some ways prohibits the possibility of revolution. Not only revolution as a kind of Big Bang transfer
right.
And transformation like the Haitian Revolution. There's a place for that kind of revolution, but also for a kind of durational way of transforming what it means to live together. Yeah. And so all of these adjustments after the end of formal slavery are meant to keep things perfectly in place in terms of the white supremacist order.
You, like everybody, watched what happened in 2020, that summer. There were some folks who were amazed at what seemed like this transformation. Some of us, I think, knew better. A lot of our colleagues got some wonderful book deals. If we're being honest and frank about that moment. How have you reacted to what has been the 180 since then, right? Whether it's, the eroding of all these DEI positions that created the attacks on Black books and Black study that we're seeing K through collegiate, if we talk about what's happening in Florida. How have you processed all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. And I mean, one thing I would say is, one of my responses to May 2020 was I wrote this short book called On Property, which was meant as an intervention into saying, look, at the root of this problem is the continuing idea that not only Black people remain property, but that property is so sacrosanct that you can kill a man for passing a so-called fake $20 bill, right? So property underwrites all of these violences that we encounter and that we're kind of struggling to transform and to pull Black life out of, and by so doing, to offer really other people along this globe more possible lives, right? So that's the first thing. But the other thing is, as you know, I'm a critic of EDI. I wrote an essay called "The End of Diversity" that has pissed some people off. I'm a critic of EDI because we know that this contemporary moment of EDI was a throwback to the 70s and the 80s, the emergence of multiculturalism as a way to manage difference. And we knew then that it failed. So it's really quite staggering to me that it came back as the most kind of robust language to address the ever-increasing inequalities that folks are living. And of course, there are all kinds of ways in which we can talk about why that is. But this kind of politics of representation, where one of us gets plucked out of the group and placed at the top of the hierarchy, and then the rest of us are supposed to invest all of our dreams and desires and hopes into that one person, is a deeply flawed way of thinking about what transformation means. But of course, it's deeply seductive because everybody is hoping I'm going to be plucked next. I often joke with my friend Christina Sharp that, the book deal is the new COINTELPRO. Because if you keep giving people these book deals, these book deals are demobilizing projects. You're sitting in your study at home, you're sitting in a cafe, spending a year, delivering that manuscript for a $10,000 advance. What you're not doing is you're not organizing in your community. You're not talking to your neighbors. You're not keeping watch on what is going down.
Yeah.
So, it's a joke, but it's serious because I
Right.
do think it has implications for the ways in which we get distracted.
And the way that we're supposed to write those books, right, for a particular kind of audience, it really takes us away from the work of Black studies.
Exactly. So many of those books have been memoirs. And I have nothing against memoirs. But how many memoirs, are we going to have? It's almost like we have returned to the moment of the slave narrative, right?
Yeah.
So these are kind of like neo-slave narratives. And we're going to tell our story of how we came into our political consciousness for white audiences to buy and put on their mantelpiece that they never read. I mean, we all know the stories that circulated of all the books that were not collected
Right.
after June 2020, when everybody went up with their syllabus and their reading lists. Well, actually, they were ordering them because we were mostly under lockdown. And then they never collected them, right?
And there's some irony to that, in the backdrop of this conversation about advanced placement courses and Black studies. And there's a way in which that 2020 moment, right, whether we're talking about Moten and talking about, an underground Black studies or thinking about the connection between Black studies and actual Black hoods in the 60s and the 70s, it's almost as if we gave all this stuff up to somebody, right, who then 3 years later could use the very language we gave them to dismantle the idea of Black studies, 3 years later.
Yeah, I mean, we're living some profound ironies, contradictions, and paradoxes. There's no doubt about that, right? I mean, going back to this question of where we began around emancipation and its legislative qualities, right? DeSantis in Florida is a perfect example of using legislation to continue to produce modes of unfreedom, right? And we're supposed to respond to the violence of that legislation as saying, well, he was democratically elected, right? So therefore, all of our energies become, we have to reform the democratic system, as opposed to using our energies to invent something that's new and more possible and more about life. And so, yeah, we did give people language to help enforce ongoing forms and modes of unfreedom.
Critical race theory, right?
Yeah, we did give them that language. But the thing is that we have to struggle around those meanings.
Yeah.
That we can't just say we gave them the language and now they've got it and they're using it against us. We have to fight them on what it actually means, right? And so that's part of the work that Black Studies has always done and will continue to do, right?
We're both chairs of Black Studies departments. What does it mean to do Black Studies in 2023?
That's, wow.
Right.
What does it mean?
And it's a question I ask myself every day, right?
Yeah, I'm asking myself that question a lot. But one thing I firmly believe in, that wherever Black Studies is happening, it must both be invested in its local communities, and it must also think and look beyond those local communities. So that for me is the first thing. If you're doing Black Studies and you're not interested in what's right around you, there's something wrong there. I believe that Black Studies in 2023 has to be willing to risk it all. That we gotta take up space, that we gotta make demands around what things mean, that anti-racism actually means something. That if you're gonna invoke the words of democracy and freedom, that they mean something. And that we're going to demonstrate to you not just that you have failed to live up to those words, but we're going to demonstrate to you in our writing, our thinking, in our music, in our programming, that there are ways of animating what those things mean that are necessary not only for Black life, but for other lives as well.
Besides your work, one of the ways in which you're known to folks in this moment is that you've pretty much dispensed with protocols in terms of how you interact with folks. There's a way in which, we don't know what Du Bois was like on the private side, right? We just know the public Du Bois, right? And there was a certain kind of decorum that he represented. And I think there's a lot of ways that even in 2023, we continue to think that we need to invest in that kind of decorum to talk about what ails black folks and what's, a danger to black life. You often don't go that way. Do you find that people are surprised when you refuse to play the respectability, decorum strategy, right? In these debates about these things that are so important to us?
I come to this question and I come to how I comport myself very much in a kind of lineage of Martin Riggs, Exis Hill. I'm a black gay man. Those black gay men were on fire in the late 80s, early 90s.
Right.
They went out saying that we should not compromise. And I really take that seriously.
Mm-hmm.
So, my response is not one to shock people or, it's really to say, look, there really is something at stake here. And it's an emergency. We don't have time to waste. We don't have time for niceties. Our little brothers and nephews and nieces are being shot as they're sleeping on the couch in their bed, right? So we don't have time for nicety. At the same time, I also believe that politics, the best politics, is generous, and that means that we bring people along. Mm-hmm. So I'm willing to engage people. I'm willing to be in conversation with all kinds of people about all kinds of things. What I'm not willing to do is to be a party to foolishness. And we know foolishness when we encounter it, right?
If someone was to describe your work 20 years ago, and then of course when Christina Sharp emerges, they would describe you all as doing Black Canadian studies. No one describes your work that way in this moment. Right, at least if they're really doing the work. And you just mentioned how, Black studies has to be about the business of what's happening locally, right? But there's also no Black studies without talking about a global Black studies in this moment. How do we navigate thinking about Black studies globally in departments in which we might have colleagues who did not come up intellectually with the language or understanding, right, of the mission of Black studies on the one hand. Folks who, for whatever reason, the kind of challenges we often see very often in social media between African Americans and Africans, right? And it's funny sometimes because it's like it's as if Pan-Africanism never existed before. like this is some brand new thing. As someone who is running a Black Studies department, how do we wrap our heads around really doing global Black studies, right? Because I hear different critiques. We need to be more global, and very often that means not African American. Right, we've had very famous people at other very well-known departments talk about this has to be about the Negro. Right, how do we really talk about Black studies in a way that's truly global at this moment?
Yeah, so I'm glad that we've come back to this, because when I say that Black studies has to be engaged with its local, it's not to say that Black studies engages with its local at the expense of everything else.
Right.
But in fact, that the local is an inflection of what's happening globally.
Right.
Right? And so I'm not worried about a colleague who is, for instance, only interested in the very local.
Right.
Because we know the Black studies in its initial impetus was about changing the world, right? Changing the world from
locally.
where, yeah, exactly. Starting locally, right? And we need to understand our local. If we can actually forge the kinds of transnational global conversations that are urgently necessary for Black people everywhere. So, I know that within some corners of Black studies, there's a tremendous problematic knee-jerk reaction to something called the African American. And we got to be clear about that, and we got to refuse that,
right.
We got to call that into question and disrepute wherever it emerges. On the other side of that, there are also some quarters of Black studies where people understand Blackness is only within the borders and boundaries of the USA.
Right.
And we got to call that and put that into disrepute also.
Yeah.
Because we know that our people have been moving across in and through multiple borders and encountering each other in, in Europe's capitals, in Africa's capitals, in the Caribbean and elsewhere. And many of us just scratch the family tree too much, and all kinds of things pop up, right? So I write from the place of Canada, because that's a place that's shaping and forming who I am.
Right. But it's also West Indian.
But it's exactly. But it's also Caribbean.
Right.
And it's also an encounter with a certain kind of African Americanness.
Right.
From Vietnam into the present, as people who left the U.S. and moved to Canada and so on. And then, of course, there's the global contribution of African American culture as it intersects and combines with other forms of Black expressive culture. All of that, I think, is the gift of Black people and Black life. Yeah. And the best Black studies understands that. It doesn't mean that all of our colleagues can do all of that. Right. And we shouldn't ask all of our colleagues to do all of that. But I think that we have to be clear and focus of why am I studying, the Rust Belt? What does the Rust Belt have to do with shale oil in Nigeria? Right. What does the Rust Belt have to do with migrants coming up the Mexico spine and moving into, right? And so it's an attitude and an orientation less than the content of our work. Right. And, because different of us are going to bring different approaches and different content to the work that we do. But the attitude that we're doing this work in service of a kind of transformational project that is global for Black people is what holds us together.
As we're having this conversation now, one of our famous colleagues, published a piece in The Atlantic on the crisis of the intellectual, raising questions about what it means to be an intellectual and how that vocation was unprepared for folks who look like us to incorporate that into the conversation. Of course, I'm reading the piece and feeling as though I'd read the piece 60 years ago, but that's a whole nother conversation, right? For you, what does it mean to be an intellectual in this moment for the work that you do?
For me, the kind of question of what does it mean to be an intellectual is one that is pretty much shaped by what are my commitments? What am I committed to? Who am I committed to? I'm committed to Black people. I'm committed to the possibility of my life being much fuller than it is. And so for me, being an intellectual has very little to do with inhabiting the university space. Very little,
But yet we do.
Exactly, yeah. Because some of us do. Yeah. But many of us grew up in and lived through communities where some of the most important intellectuals in those communities never even finished high school, right? But they had an analysis of the world, an understanding of the world, and a commitment to transforming and bringing people along with them as they transform the world that represents what it means to be an intellectual. So an intellectual is as much about study and engagement with the problem as it is taking the risk to do something about the problem. Yeah. And so I think a lot of the contemporary posture that, we find the institution, we find the academic institution is the place where we find the intellectual, really it's not at all what's at stake. I mean, let's talk about Du Bois, let's talk about Sarah Laura James, and we could go on and on of all of the Black intellectuals who could not retain any kind of sustained place in something called the academy,
Right.
right? You know, we can't have the academy be the arbiter of what constitutes the black intellectual.
Are you concerned about the diminishing platforms that we have as intellectuals to do traditional intellectual work, right? Because I think you've made the argument already that we have to think about our intellectual work as being more than the teaching of our courses and the writing of monographs, right? But for that very traditional scholarship, right, that we do as intellectuals, are you concerned about the diminishing of platforms, whether it's publishing companies that are interested in our work, or magazines, right, whether they're online or not, or platforms like Twitter?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, I think we're in a moment where those platforms and venues are both in crisis and being transformed.
Yeah.
And we have to figure out which ones work for us and how they might work for us. But I want to go back to something earlier, which is to say that, you know, before Black Studies entered the academy, we had Saturday schools.
Yeah.
We had community centers.
Right.
We had reading groups. We had, you know,
Book
we had
clubs.
black women in the book clubs sitting in parlors like this, right? Engage in conversation.
We had an independent black press.
Right. Yes, in the U.S. and so on. So we had conversations.
Yeah.
And we continue to have conversations. It just sometimes it seems harder to find those conversations. They seem more dispersed.
Right.
But also we are in a moment where social media also instantly makes people appear to be the intellectual, when actually what they are doing is a kind of gripe, a kind of grievance against how they understand themselves in relationship to something called black community.
That's deep. As you talked about, you know, black studies and diaspora, it made me think of our friend talking about roots, R-O-O-T-S and R-O-U-T-E-S. We're taking this now a month away from the 10th anniversary from the passing of Richard Ayton. Could you reflect, if you could, about how significant Richard was, you know, as a thinker, but also as a friend and a colleague?
Yeah. It's hard to believe that we are literally a month away from 10 years of Richard's passing. You know, of course, Richard's influence goes well beyond what he wrote down on the page.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, as the guy who would send you the music, the joke for your birthday, who knew every terrible Caribbean restaurant in every city, you know, but he swore it was good. You know, Richard really instantiated that kind of black intellectual. Yeah. You know, he could point you to the thing that you should look at, that you're thinking about and reading, and he can point you to something that you should read. And then, of course, there are the two books that he gifted us.
Yes.
The one that's become much better known, In Search of the Black Fantastic. A work that he really dedicated a lot of time and energy and effort to, going to the UK to talk with Stuart Hall and engage Paul Gilroy and others, but coming back to, you know, at the core of In Search of the Black Fantastic is that idea of black studies and black life exceeding these institutions, right? Yeah. Where does Richard find the most profound moments of black sociality? In the music.
Yeah.
And so it's exactly this that I think in some ways the best black studies will do. It will make the lives, the ordinary lives of black people in their music, their song, their dance, and how they dress, it will make that the measure of what we do, as opposed to disciplining it away from us, of saying, oh, it's too nasty. Oh, they should pull up their pants. Right. You know? Our comportment which is what something I try to argue in this book, The Long Emancipation. I try to argue that our comportment in all manner of fashion is a counter-discourse to the claim of freedom that white supremacy wants, seduces us with, but will never give us.
Right.
Right?
What's next for you, Rinaldo?
Next for me, I'm working on two books. I got a manuscript that I've been working on for many years called Black Diaspora Faggotry that's almost done. And I'm gonna get that out this summer, and then I'm working on a book on freedom in the sea, which I'm really thinking with all of the ancient ports that Europeans and Africans embarked from. I'm kind of thinking about, there's one way to think about the sea as the dreadfulness for black people.
Right, right.
But the sea is also the space and site of freedom. I remember as a kid growing up in Barbados, the freest black men that I used to see were men who were seamen, who worked on the merchant ships.
Right.
They were always the best dressed, they had the most gold, obviously they had currency,
Right, right.
they had cash. But they also seemed the most free, and the book begins there, you know, kind of thinking about those men, who they are, and knowing how global capitalism has transformed that, so that now most of the people who are on those boats are not black men, right? But then also I came across a story, because my partner is Somali, of all the Somalis who were also seamen, and how they too have been transformed out of that industry into other kinds of things. So that's one work. And then the second work is a work on utopia that comes directly from where I ended on property, thinking about the commons and thinking about a renewed sense of the commons. And so I'm really interested in writing a work that takes seriously Martin Luther King's notion of the beloved community, and trying to think about how do we arrive there? And what's the stakes of arriving there? And what kind of risks do we have to take as black people to arrive there?
We've been joined today by Professor Rinaldo Walcott. One of the most recent books is The Long Emancipation Toward Black Freedom. There are so many others. Thank you for giving your time today and talking with us on Left to Black.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
Black lights and Bruce burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had